Your support helps us grow. Hit the subscribe button and join our community today. My brother stole my business and told everyone I was too stupid to run it. 5 years later, he sued me for millions until I slid a flash drive across the judge's desk. His eyebrows shot up and he asked, "Do they know what's on here?" I just smiled and waited for the room to explode. My name is Noah Bennett, and I'm 32 years old now. But this story really began when I was 24, back when I still believed family loyalty meant something. I grew up with one older brother, Ethan. He was the type who could talk himself out of any trouble, and he knew it. Teachers adored him, our parents spoiled him, and if he wanted something, he would get it sooner or later. I was the opposite, quieter, more careful. While Ethan was out partying, I spent my nights in the garage tinkering with gadgets, sketching ideas, and figuring out how to turn them into real projects. By the age of 23, I'd done something that shocked everyone. I started a small but promising logistics software company from my cramped apartment. I didn't have much, just an old laptop, a cheap desk from a thrift store, and an obsession with efficiency that probably scared away more dates than I'd like to admit. I worked days, nights, weekends, anytime I wasn't doing side jobs just to pay the bills. Slowly, my code improved. I signed my first client, then 2 more. By the end of my first year, I had 5 steady contracts and was making enough to quit my other gigs. That's when Ethan noticed. Before then, he'd barely asked about my work, but suddenly he was calling for brotherly advice. He'd even bring me coffee, which was rare for him, and ask all sorts of questions about the software. I was naive enough to think he was proud of me. Maybe in a way he was, but not in the way I had hoped. A few months later, Ethan pitched me what he called a brilliant idea: we should team up. I had the technical skills, he had the business mind. Think about it, Noah, he told me over dinner, leaning back in his chair like he was already sealing the deal. You're great at building things, I'm great at making money from them. Together, we could double, maybe triple your income. I hesitated. I knew Ethan had charm, but I also knew he loved shortcuts, and shortcuts in business usually meant someone else would end up paying the price. Still, he was my brother. Against my better judgment, I agreed to make him a minority partner. I figured I could still control operations. We drafted a simple but clear contract: 70% ownership for me, 30% for him, with him handling client acquisition. For a while, it worked. Ethan brought in a few big contracts quicker than I could have managed alone. We expanded into a small office, hired 2 part-time developers, and even upgraded our equipment. I began thinking I might have misjudged him until the cracks started showing. Ethan began promising clients features we'd never discussed, forcing me to scramble to deliver things we weren't ready for. He took meetings without telling me, and later I'd find out he'd quoted higher prices than we agreed on, then kept the extra money for himself. When I confronted him, he just smirked and said, "Relax, little brother, I'm just making sure we both eat well." Then came the day that still makes my stomach twist. I walked into the office to find our 2 developers looking uneasy. Sarah, one of them, pulled me aside and said Ethan had held a meeting the night before without me and told them I was stepping down to focus on coding while he became CEO. She found it odd, especially since I hadn't said anything like that. I went straight to Ethan. He didn't deny it for a second. Sitting in my chair with his feet up on my desk, he said, "Face it, Noah, you're brilliant, but you're not built to run a company. You get too hung up on details. I'm going to take us to the next level." That's when I saw the real plan. Worst of all, our contract had a clause, one Ethan insisted on adding, that allowed either partner to buy out the other with a simple majority vote. With his 30% and the shares he'd convinced our 2 developers to sign over in exchange for inflated salaries, he now had 60% control. Just like that, my company, my creation, was gone. He handed me a check for what he called my share. The amount was insultingly low, barely enough to cover a few months of living expenses. I didn't fight it, not then. I was in shock, completely sick to my stomach, realizing I had been tricked in the worst way possible. My own parents didn't stand by me. They chose Ethan without a second thought. "He's the older brother," my dad said, as if that was all the explanation I needed. "He knows what he's doing." My mom just shook her head and told me, "You're too sensitive, Noah, business is business." For weeks after that, I walked around in a haze, almost like I was moving through heavy fog. I kept seeing Ethan in magazines, online articles, and business interviews, smiling proudly and bragging about his so-called innovations, the same ideas I had created. Friends started reaching out, asking why I had left the company so suddenly, but I gave them vague answers. I couldn't bring myself to say out loud that my own brother had blindsided me and stolen everything I built. But deep inside, something shifted. It hardened. I started quietly paying attention to everything Ethan did. I watched his moves, learned his patterns, and little by little, I noticed things he didn't want anyone to see. Then one night, over drinks with an old client, I learned something that made my heart race, something Ethan would never want a judge or anyone to find out. I didn't strike right away. I waited, not for a few weeks or months, but for 5 long years. I used that time to rebuild from scratch, to create something new, something better. I worked hard to put myself in a position where when the moment finally came, I wouldn't just get even with Ethan, I would completely destroy everything he'd stolen from me. And now that moment was getting close. In those years after losing my company, I learned to live with a constant quiet bitterness. It was like carrying a sharp piece of glass inside my chest, never enough to kill me, but painful every single time I thought about what happened. I stayed away from most family gatherings, not that I was invited often anymore. And when I did go, Ethan was always the star of the show, telling overblown stories about his successes, while my parents looked at him like he had just invented the internet. If I tried to correct even a single detail, my mom would lightly touch my arm and whisper, "Don't start, Noah," as if I was the troublemaker. Ethan played into it, too. He would look at me with that smug grin and say loud enough for everyone to hear, "You know, little brother, I still can't believe you tried running that company. You were drowning in spreadsheets while I was out bringing in real clients." People would laugh awkwardly, and I would force a smile, but inside my stomach twisted into knots. And it wasn't just at family dinners. Ethan rewrote history in public, too. I'd meet old colleagues who would say things like, "Wow, Ethan really saved that company after you left. That must have been such a relief for you." At first, I tried to explain what really happened, but Ethan had already spun the story so thoroughly that I sounded bitter and jealous. Eventually, I stopped trying. Instead, I poured everything into my new business under a different name with zero family involvement. It grew slowly but steadily. I kept my profile low on purpose, avoiding press or flashy events because I didn't want Ethan to notice my success. But he still found ways to jab at me. Once at my parents' anniversary party, he slid up next to me with a champagne glass and said, "Still doing that little freelance thing? Hey, good for you, man, not everyone's built for the big leagues." Then he patted my shoulder like he was giving encouragement. My face burned, but I kept my voice steady. "It's going fine." He just smirked, knowing exactly how much it cost me to keep calm. Our parents didn't make it any easier. My dad would brag about Ethan's latest deals, then glance at me with a look that said I was still a disappointment. My mom would hint that I should forgive Ethan, saying it's silly to hold grudges in business. What she didn't know was that Ethan had gone out of his way to block me from re-entering the market we once worked in, even blacklisting me with certain clients. One of those clients, a mid-size shipping company, called me unexpectedly one day. The owner, who I had worked with years before, sounded almost guilty. "Noah, I heard you're doing your own thing now. I'd love to work with you again, but, well, Ethan told us you'd had a breakdown. He said it was best not to drag you back into the industry." I sat there holding the phone in silence. A breakdown, that's what he was telling people now. Not that he stole my company, not that he manipulated the contract. No, in his version, I was too fragile to handle the pressure, and he had stepped in to save the day. That was the exact moment I stopped seeing Ethan as my brother. From then on, I saw him for what he truly was, an opponent, someone who liked to play the long game. But I had learned patience, too, and mine would outlast his. Over time, I started hearing whispers, rumors about him overpromising and underdelivering, about late projects, even hints that he was moving company money into his personal account. I didn't rush to act. I just collected every slip-up, every loose thread, tucking them away for the day I would need them. Then came the charity gala, one of those big flashy events for wealthy business owners. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. The next morning, photos of Ethan were all over social media, posing in a tuxedo, shaking hands with politicians. But one photo made me stop. In it, Ethan was standing next to a man I remembered from years ago, a man convicted of running an illegal overseas import scheme, James Walsh. That image stayed in my mind like a spark hitting dry grass. If Ethan was connected to him, there was a good chance he had left behind a trail. And if I could follow it, I might finally have the proof I needed. I didn't realize yet just how deep that trail went, or that a few years later, Ethan would walk straight into my trap. In fact, it was almost exactly 5 years to the day since he stole my company when the final betrayal, the one that would tip the scales completely, landed right in my lap. By that time, I had completely rebuilt my life from the ground up. My second business, a lean, efficient logistics platform with a very different approach than the one I had with Ethan, was quietly thriving. I didn't make noise about it. There were no flashy press releases, no interviews, no magazine features with my face on the cover. I wasn't chasing attention anymore. I wanted independence and peace of mind, and for the first time, I had both. The company earned more revenue than I'd ever made when I worked alongside Ethan. I bought myself a modest but comfortable home, built a small and loyal team who trusted me, and, most importantly, I could sleep at night knowing that everything I had built was mine, truly mine. Then came the email. It was from Rachel Cooper, the no-nonsense owner of a warehouse distribution firm I had worked with for almost 2 years. She and I had developed a strong working relationship based on trust and professionalism. That's why her message felt like a punch straight to the chest. Noah, I regret to inform you we won't be renewing our contract next quarter. Ethan approached us with a competing offer that undercuts your rates by 25%. He also brought up concerns about your mental stability and hinted at a history of unreliability. I'm not sure what's true, but given his industry reputation, the board decided to move forward with him. I'm sorry. I read that last part 3 times before it truly sank in. He had done it again, not only stealing a client, but recycling the same cruel lie he'd spread years ago to destroy my credibility. I could almost picture him in his sleek, expensive office, leaning back with a smug grin as he twisted the knife. My jaw ached from clenching it. For hours, I paced my living room, torn between picking up the phone to set the record straight with Rachel and doing something far more drastic. But deep down, I knew anger wasn't my sharpest weapon, patience was. So, I sat down, took slow, steady breaths, and started connecting the dots. Rachel's firm wasn't just any client, they were linked to several major freight hubs across the region. If Ethan had won them over, he would either need to deliver technology as strong as mine, which I knew he couldn't, or promise features that didn't even exist yet, and knowing Ethan, that second option was far more likely. The very next day, I called a friend in the compliance department of a mid-tier shipping company. We'd helped each other out with small favors over the years, and I knew he had access to information Ethan would never suspect. When I asked casually if he'd heard anything about Ethan's company, his tone shifted immediately. Between you and me, there's talk that he's been transferring client data overseas. It's not illegal right now, but it's risky, especially with the partners he's tied up with. Honestly, it's just a matter of time before it blows up in his face. That was already interesting, but the real turning point came about a week later when I got a call from Sarah, the same developer who had been with me in the old days. She'd left Ethan's company a year after I was forced out, but we'd stayed loosely in touch. Her voice was tense and urgent. Noah, I think you need to know this. Ethan is bidding on a massive government logistics contract, but here's the thing, he's using some of your old code, the stuff we built together. It's buried deep in the system, but I recognized it instantly. My pulse spiked. That was my original code, the one I had written years earlier when the company still belonged to me. And I still had every original file, every timestamp, every repository log to prove it. If Ethan was repackaging my work for a government project, 2 things were certain. First, he was committing intellectual property theft. Second, that old code didn't meet updated compliance standards. If it went live, it could cause massive system failures in a network the government relied on. The realization washed over me like cold water. Ethan wasn't just sabotaging my career, he was walking straight into disaster, and he didn't even realize it. I didn't let on that I knew. I thanked Sarah, wrote down every single detail she gave me, and then began digging through my old hard drives. I pulled up every backup, every commit history, every change log. Piece by piece, I gathered enough proof to show that the very foundation of his so-called innovation had been built on my work. And that's when my mindset shifted completely. This wasn't about revenge for losing a client anymore. This was about taking Ethan's entire empire apart from the inside out. Now, for the first time, I had something real and undeniable. The key was timing. I needed to wait for him to make a move that would give me a legal opening so wide I could drive a truck through it. I didn't have to wait long. Just 3 months later, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox, stamped with the seal of the county courthouse. Ethan was suing me for millions, claiming my new business was infringing on his proprietary methods. It was absurd, it was laughable, and it was the single biggest mistake he had ever made. The moment I read those papers, I knew Ethan had finally crossed into self-destruction territory, but I also knew he wasn't going to make it easy. That lawsuit wasn't just a legal document, it was a declaration of war, a war wrapped in arrogance only Ethan could pull off. He accused me of stealing his exclusive systems, damaging his brand, and poaching his clients. The irony almost made me laugh, but the numbers didn't. He was suing for $3.2 million. My first instinct was to toss it in the shredder and pretend it didn't exist, but the problem was ignoring it would mean an automatic judgment against me. So I called a lawyer, an old contact from my early days, who was as blunt as they came. He skimmed through the documents and let out a low whistle. "This is going to cost you," he said. "Even if we win, he's going to bury you in motions and paperwork. You're looking at months, maybe over a year of this." That was the part that stung. I wasn't broke by any means, but legal fees could bleed you dry faster than a bad investment. I'd worked so hard to build my second business carefully, avoiding risky moves, and now I was staring at the possibility of watching it erode, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my brother decided to throw a tantrum in a courthouse. The next few weeks were brutal. I was juggling client deadlines, endless calls with my lawyer, and the constant gnawing anxiety that Ethan might win just by outspending me into submission. The stress crept into everything, my appetite vanished, I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations in my head, and even my employees noticed I was quieter, more withdrawn. I didn't tell them what was going on. I didn't want them worrying or thinking the company was in trouble. And of course, Ethan wasn't content to let the court filings do the talking. Word got around, deliberately, I'm sure, that I was being sued for fraud. I lost 2 potential contracts within a month, both citing uncertainty as the reason. My phone became a double-edged sword. Every time it rang, I hoped it was good news, but more often than not, it was another problem. There was one night I'll never forget. It was about 2 a.m., and I was sitting at my desk with a stack of documents, my laptop glowing in the dim light. I'd just finished reviewing yet another motion Ethan's lawyers had filed, something petty and time-wasting, designed to rack up my expenses. My hands were shaking, partly from exhaustion, partly from the sheer weight of it all. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, thought about walking away entirely, selling the business, leaving the city, disappearing somewhere he couldn't touch me. But then I remembered Sarah's voice, the government contract, my old code buried inside his systems, the whispers from my compliance contact about shady overseas deals, and I realized something important. Ethan thought this lawsuit was his way of breaking me, but what he didn't understand was that he had just invited me into a legal arena where all of his skeletons could be dragged into the light. It was the first time in weeks I felt a flicker of control. I started organizing everything I had, every email, every timestamped backup, every photo, every snippet of information about his questionable partners, not as a desperate defense, but as the beginnings of something far more dangerous. I stopped pacing the floor at night. I started sleeping again, though my dreams were sharp and calculated. I let Ethan think I was on the defensive because the longer he believed that, the more reckless he would get, and when the right moment came, I'd be ready to turn all of it against him. What I didn't know yet was that the right moment was coming faster than I'd expected, and it would arrive in the form of a single phone call that changed everything. That phone call came on a Tuesday morning, right when I'd started to settle into the rhythm of balancing my business and the lawsuit. I recognized the number immediately, Rachel Cooper, the client Ethan had stolen from me months earlier. I almost didn't answer. Part of me didn't want to reopen that wound, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was polite, but I could hear something underneath it, a trace of unease. Noah, I wanted to reach out. I know we left things abruptly, and I'm not calling to change our contract situation, but I think you should know Ethan has missed 2 major deadlines for us, and the last delivery he pushed through, it crashed our tracking system for over a week. My board isn't happy. I could have gloated, I could have said, told you so. Instead, I just listened. Rachel went on to say they were already considering pulling out of their agreement with him, but they couldn't risk downtime during the transition. That was the moment a thought began forming. I didn't need to take Ethan down in one strike. I could let his own failures chip away at him while I positioned myself as the safe, reliable alternative. I ended the call on good terms, promised her nothing, but made a mental note. Ethan's cracks were widening. Over the next month, I worked with quiet precision. I focused on my own clients, delivering ahead of schedule, tightening our security protocols, and even introducing a few features I'd been sitting on for a while, ones I knew Ethan couldn't replicate without my original code. The lawsuit was still draining my time, but the discipline it forced on me had a strange side effect. My operations became leaner, faster, more adaptable. My team noticed the shift, and their confidence in me seemed to double. Meanwhile, I started reconnecting with old industry contacts. Carefully, casually, I'd ask how business was going, mention that I was working on some interesting new projects, and leave it at that. People talked, and word began to spread that I was still very much in the game and thriving. The real turning point came when a former investor from my first company reached out. We hadn't spoken since before Ethan forced me out, but apparently he'd been keeping tabs on the industry. He told me flat out that he regretted ever backing Ethan over me. If you're ever looking for capital, he said, I'm ready to put money behind you, no strings this time. It wasn't just the money, though that was tempting, it was the shift in perception. People who had once believed Ethan's version of events were starting to question it. My quiet competence was beginning to contrast sharply with his flashy instability. At the same time, my lawyer and I were combing through discovery in the lawsuit. We started seeing things Ethan probably assumed no one would notice: unexplained financial transfers, gaps in project documentation, and discrepancies in licensing agreements. It was all small on its own, but together it painted a pattern. I wasn't ready to move yet, but I could feel the balance tilting. Ethan was still the one throwing punches, but I was starting to set the arena. And then one evening, I got an email from Sarah with the subject line, "You're going to want to see this." Attached was a copy of a subcontract agreement between Ethan's company and a shell corporation registered overseas. The signature on the document wasn't his, it was someone else's, someone I recognized from that charity gala years ago, James Walsh. When I opened Sarah's attachment, I sat back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a long moment. The subcontract was between Ethan's company and a foreign entity I'd heard of before, a logistics consultancy operating out of Singapore that was really just a front for funneling contracts and data into shadier hands. And the signature, it belonged to James Walsh, the same man I'd seen standing beside Ethan at that charity gala years ago. That connection alone was dangerous for Ethan, but when I looked closer at the terms of the subcontract, my pulse started to quicken. They were moving not just client data, but portions of the government contract software architecture. The same contract Sarah had told me included my original code, which meant Ethan wasn't just infringing on my intellectual property, he was potentially violating national security clauses without even realizing the legal gravity of it. I didn't tell Sarah how big this was, I just thanked her and asked if she could quietly keep monitoring the development branches she still had access to through an old overlooked account. She agreed, sending me occasional updates that painted an even clearer picture. Ethan was rushing deliverables, bypassing QA entirely, and quietly shifting his development work to contractors with no clearance. The problem, or the opportunity, was that I couldn't just dump this information into the court records without it looking like I'd gone on some personal vendetta. I needed it to surface naturally as part of discovery or a chance revelation in the lawsuit so the judge couldn't ignore it. That meant patience and precision. Around this time, the investor who'd reached out to me earlier called again, this time with a proposition. He had contacts in the government's Procurement Oversight Committee. If I could provide proof that a major contractor was mishandling classified software or subcontracting in violation of security protocols, he could make sure it reached the right eyes anonymously. I didn't commit yet, but I kept his number close. Then came the break I needed. During a routine exchange of documents in the lawsuit, Ethan's attorneys accidentally included an internal email chain, heavily redacted, but not enough to hide the essentials. In it, a project manager expressed urgent concern about the subcontract with James's company, warning that they might not meet compliance checks. Ethan's reply was chillingly casual, "Don't worry about compliance, they'll never look that closely." That was gold, not just for my case, but for the bigger picture. I now had Ethan's own words brushing off a compliance risk tied to a government deal. It wasn't enough to end him on its own, but it was the perfect piece to tie together with what Sarah had sent me. So, I started building a file, not a messy pile of gotcha screenshots, but a clean, chronological, bulletproof dossier, dates, signatures, code repository logs, financial transfers, emails, the subcontract, everything neatly labeled, cross-referenced, and, most importantly, backed by verifiable sources. My lawyer didn't even know the full scope yet. I wanted this to be my card to play at exactly the right moment. At the same time, I began positioning myself publicly, just enough to make Ethan nervous. I accepted 2 speaking invitations at industry conferences, nothing flashy, just technical talks on data security and logistics software, but I made sure they were well attended, well read, and picked up by a few trade publications. My name was starting to surface again, this time in a context Ethan couldn't easily smear without looking petty. Behind the scenes, I also shored up my own defenses. I had my company's code audited by a third party, documented every client agreement, and even brought in a second lawyer, one with experience in corporate fraud cases. If Ethan tried to escalate, I wanted to be able to pivot from defense to offense in an instant. The more I worked, the calmer I felt. It was like setting up dominoes. Each piece had to be placed just right, and when the time came, I'd not need to shove them, I'd just flick one with my finger and watch the whole thing collapse. And then, right on cue, Ethan did exactly what I was hoping for. He filed a motion demanding that I produce all source code related to my current business, claiming it was derivative of his. My lawyer advised fighting it. I told him to let it through because I knew the moment Ethan's team got their hands on my code, they'd compare it to his and see the differences. And if the court ordered him to produce his own for comparison, the buried pieces of my original code and the traces of that shady subcontract would come spilling into the light. The court granted Ethan's motion to examine my code, and just as I predicted, his lawyers pounced on it like they'd struck gold. They sent over their forensic expert to review my systems, clearly expecting to find stolen fragments they could twist into an infringement claim. I welcomed them in with a polite smile and gave them full, well-organized access. Every file, every log, every timestamp was clean, airtight, and entirely mine. What they didn't realize was that the court order worked both ways. If they wanted to compare my code to theirs, they had to submit their own repository for inspection. My lawyer filed the request that same afternoon. Ethan fought it, of course, filed objections, tried to delay, but the judge wasn't buying it. Within 2 weeks, his code was on a secure drive in the hands of a neutral examiner. That was the moment I sat back and let the trap close because I already knew what they'd find. The examiner's review was meticulous, and when the preliminary report came back, it was better than I could have scripted. Large portions of Ethan's supposedly proprietary system were copied directly from my original pre-split code, right down to unique comments and function names I'd written years ago. Not only that, but certain modules contained dependencies tied to the subcontract with James's overseas shell company, which had no authorization to handle government-related software. My lawyer's eyes widened when he read it. Noah, this isn't just IP theft. If this gets out, it's a federal contract violation, potentially criminal. I knew, and that was exactly why I'd kept my mouth shut until now. We filed a motion to introduce the findings as part of my defense, attaching only the relevant portions of the examiner's report. It was surgical, no accusations, no dramatic claims, just undeniable facts presented with quiet precision. Ethan's legal team scrambled, trying to discredit the examiner, but the judge ordered a second independent review. The results matched perfectly. Behind the scenes, I took the next step. I reached out to that investor with government contacts and sent over a distilled, evidence-based packet, not my entire dossier, just enough to raise the right eyebrows in the oversight committee. I made it clear it was for compliance purposes, not revenge. Let the machinery of bureaucracy do what it does best. Within a month, whispers started circulating. A confidential inquiry had been opened into one of the government's logistics contractors. I didn't need to hear Ethan's name to know who they meant. His tone in court changed, less smug, more clipped. His lawyers started asking for continuances, clearly buying time while they tried to figure out how much trouble he was really in. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. We were in a pretrial conference, sitting across from each other at a long oak table. Ethan wore his usual tailored suit, but this time his collar was slightly crooked, and a faint layer of sweat glistened on his forehead. My lawyer calmly slid a small sealed envelope across the table to Ethan's attorney. Inside it was a single USB flash drive marked only with the date and a case number. Ethan's lawyer opened it, took a quick look at the files, and instantly froze. I kept my eyes on Ethan and watched as the color drained from his face while his attorney leaned in to whisper something urgent in his ear. The judge, curious about the sudden shift in the room, asked what the USB contained. Ethan's lawyer hesitated before reluctantly handing it over. The judge plugged it into the court's secure laptop, his brow furrowing as he slowly scrolled through the documents. After a few moments, he looked up and asked in a calm but serious tone, "Do they understand what's on here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, smiled slightly, and stayed silent. The question lingered in the air for a moment too long. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his mask of confidence cracking just enough to reveal the fear in his eyes. His lawyer tried to suggest discussing the matter privately, but the judge shook his head. "This is relevant to the case," he said firmly, "and it concerns the integrity of a federal contract. I'm ordering it to be entered into the official record." What followed was like watching a slow-motion collapse. The flash drive held the independent examiner's report, the subcontract with James's shell company, and repository logs proving that my original code had been embedded deep inside Ethan's system, all directly connected to the government contract. The judge didn't raise his voice or gloat. He simply said there would be a hearing to decide if the matter should be referred to federal authorities. The way he said "referred" made it sound less like a possibility and more like an inevitable outcome. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's confidence completely fell apart. In court, he stopped smirking. He no longer dared to look me in the eyes. Outside the courtroom, word began to spread. Clients were quietly backing out of deals with him, citing compliance concerns. Even Rachel, the client he had stolen from me, sent a short but powerful message: "He's finished." The federal investigation moved at a surprising speed. Agents seized company records, and James vanished overseas overnight. By the time my court date came around again, Ethan was not only facing the collapse of his lawsuit against me, but also the very real threat of criminal charges for fraud and contract violations. In the end, the judge ruled entirely in my favor. Ethan's claims were baseless, his so-called evidence didn't exist, and the counterclaims my lawyer had filed meant Ethan had to pay my legal fees. The amount wasn't small, and neither was the destruction of his reputation. Industry reports showed that his company's value had dropped to less than half of what it had been just 6 months earlier. The last time I saw Ethan was in the courthouse hallway after the final hearing. He looked smaller, as though life had stripped away the sharp edges of his arrogance. He opened his mouth like he might say something, but I simply walked past him, my steps steady, my head held high. A month later, I learned that Ethan had sold what was left of his company to cover his debts and avoid total bankruptcy. The irony was almost poetic. He had once stolen my business only to destroy his own by building it on stolen foundations. I never contacted him again, there was nothing left to say. One rainy evening, long after it was all over, I sat at my desk, the same desk, but I was no longer the same man. I opened the drawer, took out that flash drive, turned it over in my hand, and thought about all the years I had waited for this exact moment. Then I placed it back inside, closed the drawer, and whispered into the quiet room, "It's done."